Hi everyone, welcome to our last session of the day. We don't have another group of speakers, we only have one speaker in this session and then we go into the plenary session. I'd like to introduce Dr. Ian Lindsay of LSU. I'm doing it deliberately. Of Durham University, which is on top of York. So Ian has come close to York now. Welcome to that region, and looking forward to your presentation, critiquing sustainable sport for development. I'm hoping that we'll try to even get some arguments from here, debates, and relate it to what has been presented in the morning, and have just few open as we go into this discussion. We have ample time to kind of debate this issue. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Davies. As Davies has said, I think in one sense I struggled to follow some of the presentations that we've seen earlier today, because we've seen some wonderful presentations, but there was various points today where I kind of saw kind of links with maybe what I was going to say, and hopefully I'll remember to recall them as we go through. Davies suggested my talk today is about critiquing sustainable sport for development. I think I want to kind of try and problematise the term a little bit, and suggest perhaps some ways forward for both research and practice in the future. I think as an introduction to the issues at stake, Wallace and Lambert have in a recent chapter highlighted the importance of the issue of sustainability to many sport for development projects in the field, and I think this issue of sustainability, sustainable development, is widely recognised within the sector. Widely recognised as a challenge within the sector. However, I would also suggest actually that in terms of being critical around issues around sustainability and sustainable development, we have, while the terms are bandied around quite a lot, I think there's limited critical consideration of the issues at stake, certainly in the academic literature, and potentially I think in sport for development policy. Perhaps not to mention practice at the moment. And so, but where there is considerable attention paid to these issues is in the development studies literature. I missed the keynote this morning, but it suggested we have to as I understand it, we have to bring in understanding and theory from other sectors. And I think we can certainly learn in sport for development a lot from the development studies literature, in which issues around sustainability, sustainable development have, certainly the practical problems have been well recognised in the past, of projects dying out when funding ceases, of the dissipation of impact before long-term change occurs. Those issues which we can see in sport for development have been long recognised in the development studies literature. And some of the references I'll use today are references from 10 or more years ago in the development studies field that are still applicable to sport for development today. And also in the development studies field, there's been significant contributions to look at the conceptual aspects of sustainability and sustainable development. The concept has been problematised significantly in that literature, and again we want to try and draw on some of that today. But as Morgan, I think you pronounce it, is recognised that in the development studies literature, specifically when we draw in concerns about environment and ecology, the ideas about sustainability and sustainable development have, which is, as they say, something of an intellectual quagmire of contested uncertainty. And hopefully I'm not leading you down that path today, but I'm not sure my conclusions necessarily will escape that path to a certain extent. But how can we address some of that uncertainty that exists, I think, certainly in the sport for development field, if in a different scale and scope to the development studies field? I guess that's something to do with the approach, a purpose of what I'm trying to do today, and some of the approach. And I'll use evidence from the project that we've heard about from our Ghanaian colleagues earlier, and have involved Tanzania as well. That you've heard a little bit about today, and again, similar to the presentation you heard before, I think we can talk about emergent evidence. These ideas perhaps are some ideas that I'm presenting for the first time. It's evidence that we haven't fully analysed and considered as yet. as yet, and I'll also kind of bring in examples, perhaps, from some of that evidence, as well as linking it to what we can know from the sport for development literature more generally, irrespective of the fact whether it's actually related to sustainability and sustainable development in that literature. So I think, in trying to marry those two things up, I'm trying to suggest that some of the things that we find perhaps in Ghana and Tanzania, have found in Ghana and Tanzania, perhaps are more widely recognisable in the field, although I very much welcome if people want to contest that, and those people with experience of elsewhere want to contest that at the end. So I'll draw, well, as I suggested, draw on critical perspectives from development studies, and in that field, many people have recognised the distinction, and in the sport for development field has been briefly recognised by, I believe, Moore and Reid in 2011, a distinction between ideas of sustainability and sustainable development. And we've spoken, I think, a little bit today about the kind of terminology we use in sport for development, or sporting development. And also, there's a terminological issue here between using the terms of sustainability and sustainable development that I'll explore later as we go through as I go through in the presentation. And I'm guilty perhaps already of using these interchangeably when I think we shouldn't. In the development studies, they're often seen as two contradictory, or two very different approaches, with sustainability seen as a strong form and sustainable development seen as a weak form, especially when we consider ecological and environmental considerations. So authors would suggest that sustainable development is weak because we're trying to seek some kind of compromise between economic and perhaps social development on one side and environmental or ecological sustainability on the other side. And that is a contested contrast. Whereas they would suggest that sustainability is stronger in prioritising the ecological or environmental concerns. I would suggest, in the sense that sport for development doesn't have those same ecological or environmental concerns at the same level, and in fact sustainability is used in a different sense in sport for development, thinking about the sustainability of programmes. And my argument today, I think, is that if we consider sustainability to be about the sustaining programmes, I think we have to swap the weak-strong dichotomy, if you like. That I would argue that the sustainability of programmes is the weaker of the two, and we should be perhaps moving towards considering the concept of sustainable development to a greater extent. Why do I suggest that? I'll start by considering sustaining sport for development programmes. As I suggested, I think, if you not explicitly, but in the literature and in practice, I think when we talk about sustainability, sustaining programmes themselves is the kind of dominant kind of concept, or most prominent concept and most prominent aspiration. And why might that be? Why might the rationale be for sustaining programmes? I think if we look on a positive sense, or the most positive kind of rationale we can identify or find is the idea that if sport is to make a long-term change, a long-term social change for the better, then that's a long-term process. It's not a process, as Schulenkoff and Edwards suggest, that would happen with an event or a kind of short-term programme. So the rationale will be we need to sustain those programmes for a long period in order that they might bring about some sustainable long-term change. I think perhaps implicitly amongst both international donors and local partners there may be some other rationales at play. Don't necessarily have explicit evidence of this, but I'd like to put them forward as a couple of suggestions, I guess. The first, on behalf of the international donors, is this idea that they want to avoid any form of dependency on them as international donors. Dependency being seen as the opposite of local sustainability, so they want to pass responsibility for sustainability onto their local partners. There's perspectives in the development studies literature that would argue that sustainability is not incompatible with a form of dependency or a form of long-term international support. And I'm just diverting a little bit here. I think if you then look at the other side, and in-country partners, why would potentially they want to sustain the programmes they're involved in? Sometimes I think, although I haven't necessarily heard this explicitly from interviews, but from outside conversations perhaps. Sometimes it's about sustainability and sustaining and continuing their own organisations or people working within the sport for development field. That's why they want to sustain their programmes. So a variety of rationales, but I think we also see from our evidence common resource-based approaches to addressing sustainability, or sustaining the sport for development programmes, both the financial and the human-based resources. And this connects, I guess, with the dominant forms of support that we see in sport for development and also international development. The idea of money changing hands from international to local, as Cornwall and Brooke will put it, and the idea of ideas changing minds. And we see the whole range and gamut of capacity building efforts in sport for development aimed at building local human capacity to sustain, perhaps sustain programmes. Now I think this idea of sustaining programmes certainly, as I suggested earlier, has been problematized in the development literature. We see some authors like Akindes and Kerwin beginning to suggest some problems with it, and I think we can implicitly ourselves recognise problems with just trying to sustain programmes. And I'll try and actually kind of unpack that a little bit more and why we may have problems in that sense. I think, as we found, I think a lot of the inputs into sport for development are narrow kind of projects based around very specific goals with very specific inputs and very specific approaches. Commonly based on perhaps technical expertise and trusteeship from the north that I know colleagues in here have raised as issues before. And have also kind of raised, and I think it links with what we heard earlier, about the difficulty then of getting local ownership and buy-in that would then sustain the programmes into the future. I think a key aspect, again recognised by some development authors and Sanders et al. In the sport for development literature, is the dissipation of some of those human resources. We capacity build, and the staff move on to other environments. They move away from the organisations they were working with, taking their skills and expertise with them to a greater extent. And I'd actually add to that, in a sense, that I think there's another problem that hasn't necessarily been recognised in sport for development. The focus primarily and very much on a lot of programmes is on young people. Inevitably, young people grow older. And a lot of our programmes are narrow in that they focus, that we can identify, they focus on target groups or target age groups. And don't necessarily have struggled to find answers about what happens to those young people when they move beyond those target age groups. How do they kind of maintain their involvement? How do they maintain the benefits that they've got? And I think that goes both for participants, but also for the common training of peer leaders. Where are the pathways for them into the future so that they can sustain any benefits that they've gained through sport? I think, as Sen, one of the preeminent development authors, would write about, I think the idea that we want to sustain programmes concentrates on sustaining the means to development, sustaining and making an assumption that these programmes and these means do lead to positive ends. And Sen would say, it's, at a philosophical level, it's the wrong way around of focusing things. We've got to focus on sustaining the ends and then think about the means to which we want to sustain them. And I would fit into that idea some of the kind of things that we've spoken about with regard to monitoring and evaluation, and picking up here on what Kevin said earlier. I think a dominant approach, and this goes for, I think, in the development studies, and as myself and my colleague Ruth have written about recently in sport for development, the use of monitoring and evaluation as a means to prove, as Kevin said earlier, and use that evidence for advocacy for sport for development, rather than using monitoring and evaluation to question actually what do we need to sustain. We try to sustain the whole programmes rather than using monitoring and evaluation to work out, well, what aspects of these programmes may be working, what is worth sustaining from these programmes, and what may not be worth sustaining from these programmes as well. So having critiqued the idea of sustaining sport for development programmes, I want to kind of move to try and flesh out briefly, I guess, some of the issues to do with the concept of sustainable development. And I think what we would recognise from the multitudinous development literature, and this is just a selection rather than an exhaustive list, is I think it requires an alternative, something of an alternative approach to the ones that we see that are prevalent, or most prevalent in sport for development today. That's not to say that there aren't some limited examples of sport for development practice that fit with this alternative approach. And I would suggest, I've used the word limited deliberately and questioned it deliberately in a couple of ways. One, I'm highlighting these as today, some of these today as approaches, without necessarily having kind of evidence as to whether they are more successful in achieving sustainable development than other approaches. And two, I'm saying limited in the sense that I'm not sure how representative they are of other practices in sport for development. So again, I'd welcome some comments. And I'm not sure if it was a coincidence or purposeful, I guess, that many of the examples, I'm only using a few examples, but many of the people in this room have been involved in some of these projects. But what would this approach involve? I think it needs a more holistic approach. At the moment, I think we see sport for development projects commonly focused on revenue-based approaches, providing input into running of activities, running of programs. When we heard from Dr. Zachariah that we need to balance out that with other forms of support and capital, the infrastructure, the physical, social infrastructure that supports sport for development and is required for sport for development. So an example that I visited recently, now again, we can't say necessarily whether this is a good example of the actual outcomes, but Football for Hope Centre in Ghana that combined the facilities, combined the kind of community-based approach and combined some kind of revenue funding to actually put and run programs within that facility. And I think that's, from my experience, a model that we don't see very much of, perhaps, in sport for development. So a more kind of broad-based approach to the types of support and the types of input that we need into sport for development, and more based on integrated change at a number of levels. We had, again, Dr. Zachariah speaking about change from the individual, community, organisational and infrastructural systematic levels. And I think too often, in my experience, and some of the evidence suggests that sport for development is primarily based at the individual and community level. Less kind of impetus and more challenges, perhaps, at trying to change things at the organisational or systematic level. And I know of critiques of international inspirations, but we've heard some positive things today. And from speaking to Hamad, one of the inputs that international inspirations had in Tanzania was developing a coach accreditation framework that is not a physical resource, it's not a revenue resource, but it's something that will remain there after international inspirations has ceased. A more systematic input and influence there. But I think we still need to integrate those different levels of change. I think we need to recognise, and this touches on things that we heard this morning, that the process of development is not a linear process. I think too often we seek to, it's complex, it's contested, it's unpredictable. Sorry, and hopefully those kind of people with experience would recognise this, but I think we still see this kind of rationalistic approach to sport for development. We seek to rationalise what our goals are, we seek to monitor and evaluate the goals that we set for ourselves at the start of programmes, without necessarily recognising the full range of changes, the way that programmes have been adapted and adopted and adapted at a local level, and unintended benefits that might, or outcomes that might arise from that. And I think, again, the BUILD programme in Ghana and Tanzania, Youth Leadership Programme, for example, in Tanzania, we have a number of examples where this was a programme that was about development through sport, about building youth leadership. But in fact, we see some of the sustainable outcomes of that programme being in terms of schools and colleges setting up programmes of competitive sport. And that's what they saw the programme as being a catalyst to, not necessarily what was intended at the outset. So I think I don't want to duplicate, but the phrase that Grant made from the development studies literature around this kind of idea, that in order to achieve sustainability or sustainable development, we need to be smart, but we also have to be lucky in a sense. We see the difficulties of centrally steering or controlling or trying to achieve rationalistic aims and sustainable aims in sport for development, but I think we have to embrace some of this complexity. And in doing so, as Walsh said, I think there are no gold standards. I think the idea that we can set up examples of best practice in sustainable development that would be transferable to different contexts. We've heard a little bit about this links between context, mechanisms and outcomes and how context affects the mechanisms. I think with sport for development being so diverse in terms of its aims, in terms of the inputs in play, in terms of the mechanisms used, I think finding some gold standards in terms of sustainable development is perhaps a dead-end channel. But perhaps adopting more of an approach that enables local capacity to determine and achieve the diverse ends that they want is key to that practice. So to conclude, I think my argument is that wherever we are now in terms of sport for development, I think we should be trying to move towards some of these ideas around sustainable development. I think in some terms they are perhaps just good practice in development per se. And we do see, as I've suggested from example, some of this happening already. I think this is the hardest slide to put together because I think I started saying I'm going to try and avoid uncertainty and came to this slide and got to the point where I was kind of uncertain how to conclude. And I'm not sure that I'm able to effectively. I think the conclusions, I hope, are relevant to practitioners and researchers in sport for development. But I don't see them being applicable to one or the other. I see them being kind of jointly applicable to both researchers and practitioners and covering both their approaches and the kind of areas in which they investigate, in which they monitor, evaluate, and research as well. And there is a conflict, I think, in my ultimate suggestions between being more specific in what we understand and being critical about what we understand in terms of sport for development, in terms of researching a sustainable development in sport for development, and in terms of research, being specific about researching examples that might show us the way forward, perhaps, in sport for development. But I think also, on the other side of the coin, I think we need to be broader at the same time. I think we need to inculcate, I guess, some of these ideas about sustainable development, not just as separate from our everyday actions, our everyday research, or our everyday kind of actions or ways of thinking about policy and practice in sport for development, but integrating them into it, thinking more broadly around the potential and diverse aims and approaches that we might use to achieve sustainable development. And that's where I'll finish it, I guess. I hope to, as I said at the start, I think I'm at the start of thinking about this. I wanted to kind of try and put it across perspective today, and very much going to welcome any thoughts, feedback, comments, criticisms that anybody may have in their questions. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Ian. A lot of stuff here to talk about, and the floor is open for questions. You scared everyone?
Maybe I am.
The stuff that you were talking about? Yeah, okay. Now, slide 21. You talk about alternative approaches to a sustainable development or sustainability of programs. My question would be then, who defines that sustainability at that time? Because development is about power. So who defines that development? Give us an example of the project you worked on with these gentlemen. How do you define that sustainability? What is it that you want to sustain and develop?
I think that the idea, it's a good question, David. I think the idea of sustainable development itself introduces I probably should have said it as I went along, introduces the idea that we've got to sustain development rather than just sustaining programs. One of the kind of ideas I suggested in the kind of last couple of slides were about was suggesting actually defining what we mean by development to be sustained is not something that necessarily there is that gold standard or there is that one size fits all. I think it has to be a process of kind of identifying. I think it does have to, I think if it is to be sustainable, that development has to cross those different levels from the individual to the systematic perhaps. And I think that is, I think the interrelationships between those levels is important. But I also think maybe if you're thinking about the interrelationships between those levels, you've got to also kind of think about the different stakeholders at those levels. And they would all have different definitions themselves of what is the development that they wish to sustain. And that, again, going back to one of the points, is the reason why it is complex, contested. So maybe I'm being a little bit hypocritical here that I'm contradicting maybe what Sen said, is actually it's important to think about the ends, what is the development ends, but those ends aren't going to be the same in all kind of sport for development efforts. They're not going to be the same for all sport for development sectors. But we've also got to think about, well, what are the kind of common means and are there any common means? Are there any common, or things that would link together the means to which those can develop various and contested and complex development ends might be sustained? I'm not sure if that answers it.
It poses this difficult question about when we talk about the holistic approach.
Yeah.
I think that is maybe they are out of school, but they are out of school maybe because there's a financial element. But there are other things that go beyond that. And the things that we try to resolve in sport, we are not experts. And the idea then of the integrated approach and the holistic approach for me is how do we buy that license to operate to go and resolve those issues of literacy, which we are not experts about literacy. How do we, that legitimacy of us entering and talking about things that we are not experts. And that integrated approach for me then goes to a realization that there are partners there that are experts, but how do we establish those? And then later on, how do you define those targets for the sustain?
Absolutely. I probably want to move away from targets in terms of sustainability, I think. But that was, I'm sure I still have the time. I think the thing that I would say towards that is perhaps, and there are many examples of, as I understand them, of sport for development working differently to this, but it comes back to this idea of narrow projects that are maybe not making links with the developments. There's various links that need to happen, I think, and they're not easy links to create or develop, as we've found out ourselves, Davies. But I think there's various links that need to be made, in a sense, in various kind of fora, and that kind of extends not just beyond the kind of individual linking up through sport, in a sense, from an individual to systematic level in sport, but also from sport outwards to the development sector, other development sectors more generally, and encouraging them into sport as well. It's a huge challenge. I don't think it's, and it's an incredible challenge for sport to make that kind of progress, both into, as you said, into government and into other agendas in government. But I think it's something that should be, like yourself, I think it's something that should be pursued. And I think some people have influence. There's some area stakeholders in sport for development who have influence to pursue that, perhaps. I'm not sure where I'm going, but yeah, just some thoughts.
Yeah, good. Oh,
You relate to your remark, Davis. I think interesting here is that we call it sport for development, and that you debating about the definition of development and who defines it is also a contested kind of issue, of course. And well, okay, you suggest a new approach, or I don't know exactly it's new, but it's very hard to execute.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, but why aren't we starting at the wrong side? We're starting at the side of development, but why shouldn't we start at the side of sports? Sports has maybe some kind of value for development, but now we are looking at development issues and see how it can be connected to sport. We should turn it around and say, what's the power of sports, what's the value of sports, and could it be in some way help or contribute to a very difficult, contested, etc. process of development. So I sometimes feel that the sport for development programs, the sport for development organizations drift away from their own value, which is offering good sports, and maybe they can add something to it, which makes it more valuable for development. But it seems if we start at the end, it says development, and see sport only as a means to get there, maybe there are other means that are very more, how do you say this, effective or efficient to reach the development goal. So,
yeah, I think I would say a couple of things about that. I deliberately can, I guess, avoided, apart from a brief tangent, of considering the development of sport and development through sport. It's not a dichotomy, it's a kind of an overlap, I think. I deliberately avoided that. I think some of these things I was speaking about equally apply to the development of sport per se, as in some of the contexts we're speaking about, as they do to development through sport. I think those projects even that we see, I have experience of, and again, people in this room have more experience than me, they're still narrowly focused. They're still narrowly focused on getting individual young people, maybe kind of doing some kind of community work, but they're not connected to the higher up levels that will actually create an environment longer term for the development of sport itself. So I think some of these.
But I think the other way around is also true that many sports organizations are aiming so much for developmental outcomes that they forget what their value is, what's their own core business. So they are aiming at the development instead of first starting to do your core business.
Yeah, but I think like some of our I guess our African colleagues said today, in some of these contexts, what's the priority? The priority is those development agendas, and whether it is, we can argue about this conceptually, philosophically, but in some of the practice, in the practical instances, that the only way we're going to build some of the kind of aspects of development through sport, development of sport we want in some of these contexts, is to make those arguments about development through sport. We see some of the examples in Zambia, whose kind of expansion, whose kind of the sustainability of them as organisations has been built on the development through sport agenda, but they have very much significantly contributed to sports development in that country. I think
national team players.
I think the danger of this is to see them as two separate things.
I know I don't, but it's just a starting point. If you're talking about an approach and how to organize it, where do you start? Do you start with the development goal, or do you start with what are we good at, and how can we in some how contribute?
I'm not arguing for any one particular goal, though.
No, okay.
I'm arguing for a process by which development goals, whether they be off sport or through sport, are achieved, but maybe can achieve them on a sustainable basis.
I'll just take that one there. There was a hand sound. We'll see.
Yeah, quickly, could you just elaborate on what you said about projects being narrow?
Right. I think there's and this comes again from the development literature and the issues recognised in the kind of development studies up to 30, 40 years ago. I guess I kind of focus on particular goals, and maybe it links to what we've said, what you've said as well, that maybe those particular goals are HIV, or maybe their particular goals around gender empowerment, not necessarily set by the local communities themselves, based on, and this is again from the development studies literature, based on the kind of ideas of trusteeship, often, and this is again a generalisation, but it's a generalisation that exists in sport for development literature about kind of northern trusteeship, northern kind of expertise in projects, that defining the goals in the north rather than the south. And narrow, I think, as well as I've tried to suggest, narrow in terms of maybe kind of two issues. Maybe there's an issue maybe about, and this is a complex area in itself. We heard it, I think, about in Zambia, narrow in terms of particular geographical areas. Narrow, as I suggested in the presentation, in terms of age groups, perhaps as well. And I think going broader than that is a challenge in itself. Absolutely, I don't seek to suggest that that's an easy thing to solve. But I think some of our narrowness is connected to some of the organisational fragmentation that exists in the sport for development field. Lots of different partners all doing their own kind of programmes, and even if they're similar goals, slightly different approaches, their own kind of handbooks or models of working that they seek to use, or their coaching approaches that they seek to use. And an example that I heard from Tanzania was this idea of an organisation came with their coaching kind of manual, and it just didn't fit anything like the reality was on the ground, and what was required on the ground. And I think, I guess I haven't defined narrow here, but I think those are some of the features that we do see in sport for development. Again, my point here is how widespread they are, I guess. But I don't think that some of those features help, I think, maybe recognise in development studies literature to contribute to the lack of sustainability in some cases.
To provide the context to what Frank was asking, Frank, we had a discussion last night. Frank and I recently submitted a paper to their journal on special edition. I am bringing Global South knowledge into Global North. So I'm saying the limitations that we have experienced in terms of the narrowness of programs. Narrow meaning maybe you didn't do a thorough needs analysis. And the needs analysis maybe did not involve, there's things we talk about in development, the problem tree and the objective tree. So this is a problem. How is this problem? What are the causes and effects? Then what would be the means and the ends to that problem? So you have expanded it, and it ties in with your holistic approach now, because you have looked at
it's not my navies.
it then looks at, how do we then resolve this problem, because we have seen all the causes and effects. We just can't say we'll provide a football because it won't sort out the hungry, sorry, I've just introduced you to my hotbed. the hungry kid won't be fed by just kicking a ball. So that holistic approach. And in that debate, what I'm trying to say is, yes, there are organizations that do corporate social investment because their core business is sport. That's their core business. But these organizations that mostly we share here is their core business is not sport per se, because that's not the end.
There are activities that they are trying to use the value
but they are trying to use sport to reach.
What I've seen, especially in many countries, but also in less advanced areas in the Netherlands or in England, is that sports organizations seem to turn into welfare organizations, and they sometimes lose, especially what's their value.
And I think, sorry, I just thought of one other aspect of the narrative that maybe connects to Kevin's kind of presentation earlier, the idea that we're evaluating against predefined goals, looking for our kind of intended outcomes, ignoring, not ignoring, but many, not Kev's monitoring evaluation approach necessarily, but other monitoring evaluation approaches lose and don't, because of the way they're set up, don't actually can identify and recognise some of the the unintended outcomes of programs as well.
A quick question so that we go into the plenary session.
Just really, sort of linked to what you just said there about your final slide about moving things forward. You talk about the role of the researchers and the role of the practitioners.
Yeah.
But many of the problems, obviously, that we have within sport for development, particularly from my experience locally in the UK, is the way that the majority of programs are developed at a policy level, ideologically tied to, quick fixes. So, for example, the stuff that's happened in the UK where policies have been scrapped on pure ideological grounds. So how do we sort of take the good stuff that you're bringing up and try and inform the policymakers as well as part of that?
See, I asked you a tough question, you give me one back, and I'm going to make an excuse that I'm going to time to answer. I think it is the big challenge for sport for development, is to make that kind of ground into the policy makers. I think my colleagues have talked about it with my African colleagues a number of times. And David has mentioned it. I think it's changing interestingly, I don't want to go too far into this kind of idea, but the development studies field, again, has moved on from some of these ideas. It's, whether they have been implemented, it's started to move, but it's certainly kind of come into development policy. The idea of more sector-wide approaches, the international donors coming together to a greater extent to support sectors in country, perhaps the sport for development sector, but then being country-led. The kind of government is the lead kind of organisation that begins to set a framework for sport for development in that country. And I was listening to Davies speak. I don't think we have sport for development policies. We have some kind of agenda setting in sport for development policy, but no formulation of specific policies. No, I'm not calling for regulation of sport for development, but no regulation of sport for development sectors. And in the development studies area, the development kind of area, the impetus in some areas, and it hasn't necessarily been implemented well, has been for international donors to kind of press and help countries develop their country-led approach from the kind of government, while also doing some kind of local kind of work. And I think, I'm not sure how feasible that is in sport for development, but I think in an ideal world that's something about the way forward. Again, learning from the lessons, as Bello has said before, learning from the lessons that I've had in wider development previously.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, thanks for that.
If I have 4 plenary panellists down to the front, and we'll get the plenary going. Yourself and David in the chair. Not initially, I should have started. Too much. Thank you everybody for sticking with us in this workshop to the end. I'm also feeling guilty that I've kind of run over my time now, but we're very grateful for our plenary panel that I'm going to introduce now. We've heard some excellent presentations and really kind of interesting presentations, hopefully provoke some interesting debate, and a challenge perhaps is for a very big challenge is for our plenary and maybe ourselves as well to make sense of some of the things that we've heard today. We're very kind of lucky, I think, in our plenary panel today. The plenary panelists, I guess, are all good friends of mine now, I would hope, but bring together a really rich range of experience from both the Global South and the Global North, both from those who've worked in kind of academia and who've worked in practitioner and policy maker roles, and across various roles that we will speak about today. So I wasn't quite sure the order that I would go here. So what we're going to do is invite each of the plenary members to, I'll introduce them, we'll allow them 5 minutes or so to say a few words, and once we've had that from each of the plenary members, then we'll open the floor to further discussion and debate. So Claire, sitting this end, if you're alright, first up. Claire, I've known some time now, a very close and supportive colleague of mine. Claire works as International Development Advisor for sport development and youth leadership in UK sport. She's also chair of the Commonwealth Youth Sport for Development Working Group. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Claire's also had significant experience working not only for UK sport across a range of countries, but also worked for some time in South Africa for, first of all, with VSO and also for SCORE. I think there's maybe a competition here for who travels the most, but Claire, I think you're right up there. And I think amazingly has managed along the way, I think, to fit in an MSc in Development Management at the London School of Economics, so is eminently qualified to speak on some of the debates that we're having today around sport development.
Thanks, Ian. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there. And that was a nice introduction, but I always think it's good in these opportunities to listen, and I often find myself trying to absorb and make notes that make it practical, because I guess my job day to day is to put all of these learnings into real life programs and frameworks that actually make things better. And I understand the topic is global to local, and I wanted to start by saying we need to be careful in this room when we talk about the power of sport, and that was how I was going to start strongly. But then I got here today and I realised I'm connected to 85% of people in this room very much through the power of sport. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit and actually talk more about and answering some of the questions. We need to be really sure we know the value of the work that we're doing when we talk about sport. And I think when we really question ourselves and our partners and the work we do on the value of what we're trying to do, be it an activity, a framework, an approach to monitoring and evaluation, we're actually answering some of Ian's questions about sustainable development, because the programme will end and funding will end if the value of what we tried to do at the beginning has been defined, and we believe in that value. So if the value is more coaches, because we value coaches, or more youth leaders, or more trained practitioners with more skills, then once the funding ends, we can't question that there's a value there. And I think one of the challenges we have at the moment is we're not sure really on that value as stakeholders at the beginning. And so we get to the end point, and I say, ooh, I need to justify that narrow program. And the partner says, but all these amazing things are happening, and I know that, and we see it, and we discuss it. But the place to capture that is very limited. And as practitioners and academics in this field, we've got a really strong call to arms now coming up, which is the post-2015. They're not Millennium Development Goals anymore, they are Sustainable Development Goals. And whilst we know sport was not good, we would love, right? We would love that to be there. Wasn't going to make it in. What will make it in, and what we understand, is that many of the issues that Sport for Development has been addressing over the years, but critically, there'll be a call to understand how do we achieve these goals. And we need to be ready to respond to that call. And I think that's what, listening today, we've heard about safe spaces, and again, narrow and broad concepts of that. If one of the goals is very much on empowerment for females and women and their space and gender-based violence, really understanding and unpacking safe spaces is going to be critical. Monitoring and evaluation. For who are we doing it for? We have amazing debates with my colleagues here about the value and why we're doing work. But when it comes to reporting back, it's just one line or 2 lines. And I think there's a space for everybody to be more open and flexible. And I know, and I'm here, and we talk about the binary. David will challenge me on this one a lot, and where the knowledge comes from. But again, we heard in Kevin's Kevin's presentation, EduMove and so on, that's come from the Global South. That's there. And don't think anybody in these rooms, they don't suffer fools gladly. We have those conversations, and the more open we are in those conversations, the better we can move forward too. My final comment before I hand on, probably in time, it was about was just about the International Inspiration Programme, actually, which was the London 2012's Legacy Programme. And it's coming to an end now, a hugely ambitious programme, 20 countries, 12 million children. I think one of the key positive outcomes of the programme, with various levels of successes across the countries, was the approach, and this integrated approach that I've heard from colleagues. At 3 levels, they call them the 3 Ps, at policy, practitioners and participants. So any move to change in the field targets those 3 areas. And to extend on the example of Tanzania given, the shift has been, it was international inspiration, and Tanzania has now launched its own national inspiration. Taking the best bits and making it carry on to work for Tanzania. Am I right?
Yes.
And I think that's a really good example of sustainable development, not sustainability of the programme. The programme won't sustain after funding, and I do think we shoot ourselves in the foot with that. Nothing sustained without a little bit of money going in, really. My local swimming pool won't, my local tennis club won't. Why should it be any bigger in the Global South? We need to ask ourselves that question. We often assume it must sustain after 4 years. Why should it? But if we believe in the value that we started with, then the key bits will sustain from there.
Right, thank you, Claire. Next. Next we have Dr. Hamad Ndee, who is a senior lecturer in physical education and sports studies at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Hamad's a sport historian by expertise. In terms of the history of sport in Tanzania, perhaps from some of the traditional games that we spoke about, through some of the, I've had many conversations with him about the Norwegian input in the 1980s, which has been fascinating. And so he brings kind of a long-term, perhaps, perspective on sport and international development. He brings a kind of a perspective that we don't have as an Olympic athlete from 1972. I thought I'd just bring that in, Hamad. But Hamad's also incredibly well connected within the Tanzanian Sport Network. I love Hamad's story when I've visited him, that everybody I meet in Tanzania has probably passed through one of Hamad's classes at some time. And Hamad always threatens them by saying, I can always take your degree back if they don't do what Hamad does. But I've never heard of anybody to say that that has actually happened, which is a testament to Hamad, the way Hamad operates. So I've developed a really strong friendship with you, Hamad, in my time, and very much welcome your thoughts just now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you, everybody. I will start by saying that, well, actually this is what sports for development, and we really need to conceptualize both in the global south and in the global north. Do we mean the same or one and the same thing? Maybe it's different. That's where actually I think we need them to think of other things in connection with that. And then listening to all the presentations in the morning and in the afternoon, one thing that strikes me is when we don't define clearly in terms of global south and in terms of global north, then the quickest thing we do, whether the project has failed or not, we look at I now borrow Kevin's the proof of the impact rather than understanding it, what happened, the process. We looked at the results without looking actually, did we understand it from the beginning? And how did we aim at doing it. So when we look at the totality, rather than the process itself, how did it start? And even worse, who started it? Is it the people from there they needed that one? Or is it imposed from there? So when we are looking at the impact, again it depends on you're looking from what point of view. From the global south or from the global north. So sometimes we say, oh, this one has failed. Actually, not looking at the process. How did it happen? And then I come to another presentation, which was of Ramo from there. We say, when we understand what we go wrong, that's when we can build this space. And a space actually has been defined in many ways. It's not just focusing on one thing, on the impact, because the word development itself is so complex that what do we call development? Well, the quickest thing is a step forward from where you were yesterday. But then you can be putting that step backwards, you see. So we have to look at what are the ingredients involved there and who started it. Is it imposed from there? Like in the early 80s, I happened to work with people for sports for all development from the Scandinavian countries where the Norwegians were there, the Finnish were there, the Swedish were there. Now, again, I borrow David's words to say, what do you need? These people are hungry. You bring them balls and the uniform. What are they to do with it? They are hungry. They can't keep the ball. They put on the jerseys, but they are hungry. So they are. What I'm concluding to say is that we really need to define. Maybe then, before even we embark upon a project as such, we need to sit down together and say, well, this is what we need. Does it fit here? Are we looking for the results, the expected results, or what goes with the result within the process? So I think we need to define jointly define the project, what actually we want to do, what do we want to achieve before we embark on the project.
Next, we have Lucy Mills, who is business development, recently become business development manager for grassroots soccer. I'm amazed in the sense that this is the first time I've actually met Lucy, given the amount of correspondence we've had maybe over the last year or two. So we're very delighted that she could be here today. Lucy, again, brings experience, a variety of experience in different locations within sport for development. She managed the FIFA Football for Hope project on behalf of Street Football World. There's also work for Coaching for Hope in South Africa. I wasn't actually too aware about the connections with Ghana before very recently, not only with one of the Football for Hope centres there, but also coaching for the University of Ghana 10 years ago, and won, I believe, the Ghana University Games. When I invited Lucy onto the plenary panel, I was worried that there wasn't an initial programme, a football game today, which I knew Lucy was going to play in, and I was worried that the plenary would stop her playing in it, but I've seen it's disappeared from the programme, so I'm glad I'm not holding you from that, Lucy.
Thanks.
Good
job I didn't have to choose, but and on that, I honestly feel a lot more comfortable wearing the tracksuit than being in the field, so this is quite a novel experience, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. So as Ian said, I've been involved in sport for development for over the past decade, and I know I don't look old enough. But up until December last year, I was managing the Football for Hope Centres project from Street Football World's office in Cape Town, and working with about 16 NGOs, 18 NGOs in 16 countries. And I was actually at a Gender, Sport and Development conference in Egypt in 2009, and the project, the Football for Hope Centres project, the World Legacy project, was was very contested by several academics in the room, and so it's really nice and refreshing, and you know, it's quite warming to hear that Ian has used the Play Soccer Ghana Centre in Cape Coast as one kind of up there as a beacon for what the other centres should be looking at in terms of sustainability. So that's really great. Now relocated to London in a business development role, so it's a very different role for me. And when you were talking about the NIF and in the Zoom presentation about the donor expectations, I'm very much in that world now, and so I'm conscious of sort of perpetuating the narratives within the global north and kind of pleasing the donors. And I find myself working closely now, closer than I ever have, with some of the big donors in sport for development. So coming here today, I think the 2009 conference was probably the last academic conference that I've been to, and so that several years have gone by, and it's really wonderful and surprising to see that the debates and the growth of the sport for development sector, kind of practically and geographically and thematically, is also parallel with this growth in research and in discussion and sharing ideas on a theoretical level. So I think that's the thing that really has astounded me the most. We tend to be biased. I'm a retired football player, and so we have that inherent bias that we believe in the power of sport. And yet, with this increasing research and knowledge base, we can legitimize and justify our interventions to possibly the more traditional mainstream development community and possibly the non-sporting community as well. So I think it's a positive. I think a couple of other things really, interacting with some of grassroots soccer's big donors. One in particular has moved away from, so originally they had a Sport for Change stream, a funding stream, so we were, and several organisations applying to that stream, and now they have mainstreamed Sport for Change within their overall outcomes, whether it's HIV, health, whatever. So that for me is a shift in that sport for development is being integrated and kind of compared and contrasted against the more traditional development approaches. And so we are now, as our organisation, we have to be smarter, we have to be innovative, and we are in effect competing against non-sport for development NGOs, and I think it can only be a positive thing. It's kind of inviting more doctorate and academics and researchers to get, to help us with, with justifying our program. Interesting as well, Kevin, what you said about, the need for proof. I think, for me, just having worked in the field over the past few years, I think that we have strived for that, for sure. And originally we had big targets, and it was about a number of kids going through the programs, and we were celebrating that. And now there's a shift towards outcomes and looking at the longer term engagement of young people going through the programs. And I think we are being more sophisticated about how we see and conceptualize our programs. So, I was kind of glued to you, listening to you in that, and I'd really like to talk with you more, because I think that we are going to learn so much. I mean, I've learned so much from several presentations today. And I think it comes down as well, talking about what is the value add in our approach as sport, as a methodology to development, and that's something that we just continuously have to think about. I've always, come from a football background. I'm constantly working in football, so I think the big thing for me is that how can we make sure that sport for development transcends the negative aspects of the game. We all know too well the criticisms of football and discrimination and gender imbalance and so on, but can we as a sector transcend those ills? And then I think the last point I want to reflect on is Dave, is what he said about the role of the national governing bodies. So, having worked alongside FIFA on the Football Hope Centres project, we were working with NGOs on that project. So we were actually sidelining a lot of the time the national federations. And so there's a bit of tension there between NGOs and the national federations. With grassroots soccer, we're using football methodology, football language, metaphors. The curriculum, the HIV/AIDS education curriculum, uses football parallels, but there was very little football in the curriculum. And so a few years ago, what the organisation found was that kids themselves were saying, like, we want to play more soccer, and we weren't really providing that. So one of the things that we've been doing the past couple of years in South Africa is working with SAFA, the Football Federation, to get our coaches accredited, to get teams set up, to include them in the local league. So now we've got a girls' football team registered with the local football league in the Western Cape. They got promoted last season. They're doing very, very well. And it's also a feeder for the coach development program. It's a feeder, to go into the school. So it's very much, I think that we've possibly neglected the football specific side of it, and now we're going back, and we've got this internal strategy within the organisation called Soccer in Grassroots Soccer, football in grassroots soccer. So yeah, soccer and grassroots soccer, to really put football back to the forefront of the organisation on various different levels, be it programmatically, be it fundraising, harnessing the football industry. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at the moment, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Finally, I'm kind of aware this might seem as something like a club of people I've kind of worked with. I think if there's one person who's going to speak out and speak against a kind of a conformist perspective, perhaps, not that we've had that, would be Dr. Bello Bitugu, who is currently the Director of Sport and recently commenced as the Director of Sport at the University of Ghana. I have recently, it's only recently I guess I spent some time with you, Bella, but I find your kind of everything through your background up, and you said absolutely kind of fantastic, bringing a huge kind of range of expertise. You were, before the University of Ghana, you were country director of Right to Play in Ghana, and previously spending a lot of time in Austria, teaching not in sport, but development and sociology in the University of Innsbruck in Austria, but also kind of involved in a number of kind of sport campaigns around kind of racism and other aspects before moving more into sport for development. So a huge kind of range of experience, and I'll pass the floor on to you, Dr. Ghana.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Good evening. When I was informed about sustainability in this project, in sports for development projects and towards its future, a global future, what I thought was, yes, what is the sustainability? Why is it missing? And where are we? And how can we get there? And I just have been thinking through, and I realized there are a few things. Sports for development is an area. Some people will say it's new. Colta says it's not new, because if it were new, we wouldn't have thrown on its strength. But basically, the strategy itself as an advocacy has been very new, and there have been discussions on about its sustainability. We know some of the successes that have been choked. We know of some of the failures, and we know of some of the dangers and potential dangers, and even conflicts. This kind of strategy has formed the quasi-development strategy too. But one thing that I have realized, which we need to watch, which has been a problem with this strategy, is what Wagner would call displacement of scope. That is taking it so huge, really taking it so huge, and saying you, like Davis was saying, we have the problem 3, the objectives 3, what is the causal effect of this, the lack of this, the lack of that, and then we just are going and going and then picking areas, and so there are really no limited scope. We say, let us operate here, let us check this, but it is so vast and so huge, and we finally end up like, saying we are the magicians, we can solve all your problems. So that for me, it's really a very, very huge problem. Then, when you go to sports for development conferences, discourses, like we are here, and I was happy I was at the opening ceremony by Trevor today, the keynote address, where he said, look, we shouldn't be interested in just quoting and recollecting literature, but rather framework. Within which framework, what is the framework within which we are operating? Do we just say development is good, sport is good, and so come do it? Where is the framework within which we are operating? Then that for me definitely is a problem, because you come and hear the same thing all through. You take the book, you read the same thing all through, and it is like a vegetable garden. Get the tomatoes here, get the carrots here, get the pepper here, and the rest, and then you are not you don't know where you are from and where you are and the rest. One other danger that I think we are prone to in the area of sports for development, in the academic area, for example, it's, and I've been telling Ian this, when we come to discuss, what we transfer into the discussion of the strategy itself is the discussion of ideologies and perspectives. We don't discuss the issue itself, but I bring my ideologies and perspectives mainly from the social sciences, and then pitch mine against yours. And coincidentally, I mean, this is what Ian and Grayton said, and I totally agree with that. That shift is very necessary. I mean, what is the strategy itself, rather than saying I'm representing an ideology or a perspective. Then again, in the academics itself, there is something happening which I call really, I dare say that, but I really would say it, academic imperialism. It's marks of it. Just go to any sports for development conference or meeting. Count how many people are from sub-Saharan Africa or the global south, where most of the projects are implemented. Most of the people who discuss this discourse are from what we call global north, and maybe the power of the resources that they have or the opportunities that they have. How many books have we published? How many books have people from sub-Saharan published on the workings of sports for development? You don't see so much. The best books are written by people from global north. Why? Because they have the access and the power. You know, I tell you something. When coming here, it was tough for some of the people to get the visa. Oh no, what am I coming to do in England? It's even a hassle coming to England. Some of us don't even want to come to England. No, honestly. Some of us are even tired of being in Europe, you know. And then you go through a hassle, and they tell you, I mean, you realize that it's really fortress Europe. And how can you benefit? You can't even come and say, here you are invited to a conference, you have been provided everything, and you go through this hassle. And what if you say, I'm coming to do research here? You won't even get it. But somebody from the global north, 5 minutes, send it online, get visa, boom, come, go, do the research. Goes everywhere. This also has to be watched in this area. For me, that is also a factor. And I think we also have to really watch the kinds of terminologies that we use. Sometimes they are too patronizing, too Eurocentric. You know, partnership, collaborations, community, locals. Once you hear that word, global south is involved, you know, and it sometimes it is associated with certain centrism. And I think we in the area of sports for development say that we are the bottom up, we are inclusive, we are responsive, and I think we also have to channel our strategies and our content in that regard. And I also think that if we really have to check some of these things, then there are a few things we need to really watch. We all knew that Millennium Development Goals, we can't reach them, they have failed. It's been a failure, we know it. We knew it even about 5 years ago. But then you need to ask yourself, what is the role of sports for development in the sports for development, the role of sports for development in post-2015 development agenda? That we need to really ask ourselves, not really always ramming and going on about the 8 Millennium Development Goals and on and on and on, but we really need to position ourselves strategically and then also ask ourselves within which theoretical framework are we really going to operate in the future, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And last but not the least, I think it is very important to mention proof. But the problem that I have with proof here is, and I agree with the Solent, is it Kevin? Solent presentation, and there was also one about the proof. But you see, for me, often when you talk of the proof, it's like you want to justify why you are asking for more money and why you should get the money. For me, it should be outcome. To show that you are a sustainable strategy, and I'm even afraid now to use that word now. We discuss it later. And what have I done? What have I achieved? What can I do further and build on this strength and learn from the weaknesses? That for me is the proof. I don't think we really have to worry about going to prove why we exist because we need money. Yes, of course we need the money for that, but if it becomes our preoccupation, then it will be a problem, and that has been it. In any case, I think if I start, I won't stop. So, thank you.
Like the way he talks, you just want to let him talk. Yeah. Thanks very much to all the presenters. I would like to open the floor for questions. And then my trick of switching with Ian was that I don't ask the questions. So he's on that side and he's very fast questions. So open the floor. Questions for the panel. Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. It's fantastic. I think this sort of links back to one of the last things that I said to Ian in his presentation. And it's a bit of a comment, but it's also a question as well. And I think one of the problems that I think we have in the field of sports development as well, is that you've got the academics who are doing their own things, all of the discourses surrounding how they operate and the research they're conducting and things that they're observing about the field, etc. And then you've got on the other side, you've got the practitioners who are doing their things, etc. And I think one of the big problems that we have is all of these observations that we make as academics, or these critical discussions that are taking place, we need to do more to try and get that knowledge into practice. So, for example, what I was saying about trying to get the message around sustainability into policymakers, trying to get the problems that we have in monitoring and evaluation into the heads of policymakers and practitioners as well. Because I think until we start to move that field forward in that respect, I think we're just going to continue to potentially go around in circles. So I think it's a bit of a comment, but also maybe a question to any of you really about how can we start to not necessarily build a bridge, but maybe try and connect us a little bit more around moving that field forward. If that makes sense.
I wanted to address this question because there is a network at the moment which has been established, courtesy of GIZ, this international network for sports for development and peace, established by 3 universities in Ghana, in Cape Town, and in Germany, Sporthochschule Cologne, and there is also XP, which is the International Council on Sports Science and Physical Education. The idea has been to map out the field of sports for development, get outfits which are operating there, and streamline the curriculum and the rest. And this link has been launched. The University of Ghana is the secretariat. One Bello happens to be the chair of this network, and my brother Emmanuel was the one who actually started that groundwork. And that is a possibility. It will be open soon to the global audience or actors. That area that you have mentioned is actually one of the problems that we have, because we have created a wedge, intentionally or not, a wedge between the academia and praxis, because most of the areas and sectors have always, created a bridge between these two aspects: the theory, the abstract, up in the air there, to bring that down to the practical levels, medicine, economics, whatever. But we have failed a little bit. We have really diverged ourselves from theory, or diverged ourselves from practice. And that is maybe an addition to what we should do for sustainability. And if I had my own way, I would say every academic research as a condition must have a practical project on the ground to work with that kind of thing. That is what I would say, and maybe it will be an encouragement for us. I mean, we need to do it. Nobody will do it for us, So we in our own academic spheres should also not only say, I want to investigate a project or a phenomenon, but rather I say I would like to see how it works and feed them with our results. Not this, saying I'm doing it to put it on the shelves, but rather to use them and the rest. But because we already say we are different, we are sustainable, we are innovative, we are creative, we are cost effective, we are blah blah blah, yeah? So let's do it on the ground as well, and this should be one of the things. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And then there's in addition to that, you guys are sitting the offices with the donors and that, and you've got projects in Africa, Clare and Lucy. And this is a thing, because you make those decisions. You're in the agenda setting, you're in the decision making within those panels. And somebody says they are going to Africa for 2 weeks and they will come back and they will write a report. It will have fulfilled your job yourself within that job. Maybe it's just due diligence or whatever a report has been written. But because you are involved in this debate, and we should be careful in who goes out there to collect information and write about the information. And this is where it's difficult within our area.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment there also. You see, sometimes when you talk of the policymakers, actually you're talking about the politicians. So politicians, they've got their own agenda. And then academician, he investigates something. But is the politician ready to use the results of the research? So they are also, we need also to kind of synchronize with the politicians also. So because sometimes they have got their own priority, and they are the ones who are sitting in the parliament. A politician, an academician is not sitting in the parliament. So you come up with, let's say, we go to research and with proof, with everything, but it's in the shelf, not being used.
I think just a positive case study from grassroots soccer, we have a number of partnerships with research institutions. So London School of Applied and Tropical Medicine is involved in conducting a randomized control trial in South Africa, one of the first of its kind in sport development. National University of Science and Technology in Zimbabwe is very heavily involved in research there. University of Western Cape, University of Stellenbosch, University BITS in South Africa as well. So the organisation is fortunate in that it has the capacity, it has a research monitoring evaluation department. I think I would kind of throw that back out to the smaller organisations that struggle to fill out the reports and on that level.
Yeah. And then that is different with, take for example the two of you and the amount of time you have spent in the field. Okay, even when I'm presenting here, I'm conscious because you know the field better. When I was presenting, you are aware of what happened there. Whether I'm presenting something here in terms of I want to please the funders, but you have worked there, you have that that experience of the field. You are a different breed of people that are sitting within there as representing donors because you have had enough experience from the field.
Yeah, just to respond to that and what we need then, because the other thing is, while research goes on, the field moves, and it moves quickly.
It's very dynamic.
If you did say, when you said earlier, someone said they were going to Africa for 2 weeks, I say it's a big place, David, where are they going? So, as we know, I mean, and that's the sort of things that get challenged. So what do we need? We need that information in one page. We need the key points. We need safe space. It's not just a safe space. It's the coaches, it's protection, it's the challenging environment, and that's the gap actually. And I think this is one of the examples of good practice where we work together with the academics, with programs, with people with the money, and talk about it. And one of the advices I've got is to, when you get your group together, set the ground rules. This is not about individuals, this is about learning, doing better, and sharing that information. Nothing's written down, nothing leaves the room, and it's in those conversations, which can usually be outside of the office or outside of the formal meeting, that are most fruitful. And we can't forget that development, sport field development, contested, unlinear. So it's all of those pieces around the edge that make this field, not necessarily the presentation and the follow-up. And we have to remember that in all the roles that we take.
You are the main chair. So, any questions? Lena, you were happy with how he was pronouncing his German names. The two of us.
Oh, right. Okay.
Question?
Well,
comment?
I hope there will be another occasion or opportunity to discuss this issue further. Because if I want to take the floor, it will take another 15 minutes. It's very, very important.
I am a very strict chairman.
It's very important we define our position
Okay,
as
so
advocates for sport for development.
we start now, so 5 minutes.
Well, 5 minutes, let me then say that, like my sister Claire said, we are moving from Millennium Development Goals, which Africa has mostly failed, to Millennium Sustainable Development Goals, which are yet to come, but I don't see how we are going to fit into it. But then what concerns me is that we need to have a clear paradigm shift from professional sports if you come to talk about sports for development. Because we are talking about individual development and national development, community development. But are we using the same approach and the same methodology as in professional sports? Now, if you look at professional sports, It is one, over-commercialized, it is over-militarized, it is over-politicized, and over-nationalized. In the sense that the international federations, either overtly or covertly, pitch nations against each other. And it appears as if we are using professional sports as war in time of peace. And it has actually enticed or galvanized governments to put more money into sports, professional sports, and they neglect sports for development, which is in the global south more important. Because if you build the human capacity, that's where you get national capacity, national development coming as a matter of course. Now I'm talking about sport being over-militarized, because if you look at all the jargons in sport, it is all military jargons. Okay? Right from the first group, they say you are the captain. Captain is a military jargon. They say we are going for camping when you are going to group for to prepare. We talk about the striker, talk about bullet shot, talk about defense. Something like the strategy. Indeed, this has occupied my mind for quite a long time. And as a member of the Commonwealth Advisory Body on Sports, at one of our meetings when we were talking about sports for development, I propose that we no more use the word talk of war, which again is a sport, but it is war. So why don't we adopt the name talk of peace? Indeed, it was adopted at the Commonwealth level, and I introduced it to Ghana, to the president. So all journalists now use the word talk of peace for that game, not talk of war. I believe sport for development should aim at having a clear paradigm shift from this militarized, commercialized, politicized professional sports jargons, so that we have a clear-cut agenda to demilitarize our activities and make sure that our leaders, the future leaders, are conscientized in a way that they see sports as a friendly act between nations, between individuals, between communities. Because of this over-politicization and commercialization that has brought about bribery and corruption, all this violence and things actually stems from this sort of mindset if you come to talk about professional sport. I have been in it as the chief executive of a national sports council, and I know the bribery and corruption that goes is quite dirty. I dare say, because I have been handed over a package to go and give it to a referee, which, it is something we have to have a paradigm shift from this sort of practice. As I said, if I want to talk about
I didn't want to stop him from talking. It would be an African for me to stop an elder from talking. So I was respecting the order to continue talking, but I'm mindful. The guy in there was switching off, meaning I think they were told to finish at 6 o'clock and go. So he switched off everything, he peeked through the door, he made signs like, are we going out or not? Okay, so if I'm handing over to you, so that
I'll just, I guess, if I look at a couple of words from me, I'd like to thank obviously our kind of plenary panel. I'd like to thank the kind of presenters who we've had today. I think from my perspective, having suggested the workshop, I think it's certainly going to achieve the things that I hope for. I hope that all you as audience and presenters and plenary panel have equally found the workshop interesting and valuable, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.